So today I'm going to walk through my track Embodiment from my record Resilience that I put out earlier this year. This is one of my favorite tracks on the album, and there's a couple cool things that I did in this track, so I just wanted to kind of show a little bit of how I put these things together. So just to give you a little sample of like the full mix. So there's a handful of cool stuff going on here, and this album for me is one of the first things where I used almost exclusively like audio recorded in, so like not using VSTs, instruments and stuff like that, recording guitar and microfreak through pedals to create a lot of these layers. So a lot of the effects are baked into these audio files. And so I think I'm just going to go through and sort of talk about the elements as they get introduced sort of chronologically in the song. So the first thing we start off with is just this is labeled JVC cassette noise. And so this is just a little sample that I sort of keep in a folder of, I have a JVC hi-fi cassette tape player, and I just, recorded a little bit of the noise without anything on the tape. And it's just a little snippet, but it's enough to give a little bit of background noise. And you can see, without the EQ, it's almost white noise or pink noise. So I just dial it down a little bit so it's not overpowering, but it does give a sense of, I don't know, there's something about tape noise that just gives it some life. So if we play the whole mix, it cleans it up without it, but to me, I don't know, there's something about it that just kind of brings some sense of spaciousness to the whole thing. And then, so the next element that comes in is this bass, which is a Jogging House sample from one of his packs. I don't recall which. It may tell me in the sampler. What sample is that? Yeah, Sounds. It's 58, number 58, bass 7. And I call this, I saved this as an instrument called No Harmonic because the original sample has kind of like I don't remember if it's a fifth or a fourth or something as a kind of an overtone, but I just EQ'd that overtone out so it was more of just the fundamental, and then bounced that and made this sample instrument out of it. And you can see from the MIDI, this is a super simple bass line. And there's some noise in there, which I believe is from the original sample. So yeah, real simple. But that little bit of a shift going to that lower note gives a sense of movement, makes the track feel like something's happening as opposed to just sort of like a drone. And I love on this track how that gives it this really like, I don't know, almost feels like a ship swaying on the ocean, kind of soothing rhythmic feel to it. The next thing to come in is this pad sound here, which is called Ghost Bells pad. And so this is another one that I just made a Logic sampler instrument out of. I made this instrument a while ago and I pulled it up for this track, but I believe this is from one of the Spitfire Labs instruments, like a handbell instrument or something. And so you can see the full sample is in here, but I just cut off the attack. So all you're hearing is the kind of the tail. And it's a stereo sample. It gives it a little spaciousness. And I have the pan on each one of the notes as it's triggered. Every time I hit a note, it's sending the pan of that particular voice to a different place. And so this is kind of bouncing around, and you can hear how that gives it this sense of swimming around your head. And I love this sample because it has, you can hear the kind of clicks and ticks and noises in the background. And I just love how that adds extra little texture as these things are kind of swirling around. And because of the way it's set up as like a pad, so we have, 2 seconds attack, 10 seconds release. You don't ever really hear when a note starts and when a note stops, so it just creates this swirly thing. But there's actually very little I say very little, 45% on Supermassive for the reverb. Let's see, without that. Yeah, so it's still really smooth, but really textural without the reverb. And the reverb obviously smooths everything out and helps it kind of sit in the mix a little bit more pleasantly. What else do I want to talk about? So these two here are... it's audio that was recorded in when I had my Poly Bebo pedal, which I actually got rid of to get the Zoya. But I made some really cool patches on it when I had it for a little bit. And this was one of them that I think was like a couple different granular modules with different settings and maybe like a smear module. And then I believe the reverb that I used on this was the Mercury 7. And the synth sound just came from the Microfreak. So again, this is just Microfreak, Poly Bebo, and Mercury 7 recorded straight in. So the reverb's baked in. But it gives it these just lovely little twinkly kind of background accents. And this is another one from Microfreak that I believe, again, I would have used Mercury 7 as the reverb on this. So the reverb's baked into the audio track. And it's just Microfreak, and I'm just playing with the speed and intensity of an LFO for... I don't know if that's cut off or just volume. I think it's cut off, because I don't think you could put an LFO on the volume on the Microfreak. But pretty big reverb, and again, this kind of just... It's not exactly buried in the mix, but it kind of comes in and out as these little, fluttery, twinkly bits. And then before we get to the guitars, the last element I'll go through here is this wind chimes, which let's take the reverb off to hear. So I love this, and this is the type of layer that I'm tempted to resample this and pull it out and maybe even use it in a different track, because I just love the textures that this creates. And so the way I made this was, this is a wind chime. Actually, my neighbor has a wind chime that I just borrowed and recorded some samples from it, and made again, a little Logic sampler instrument with just one wind chime hit, and it's pitched because of the sampler. And I have that sent through Ridgewalk, which is this really cool plugin that Aqeel Aadam makes that creates these kind of textural and repetitive kind of resamples and cycles through, and there's a lot of different settings for how it records and stuff like that, which I may do another video just talking about this, because there's just a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. But for the sake of this, you can just hear how one sample becomes this really lovely kind of repeating, looping textural thing. And you can hear it has some noise and some kind of warble to it. That's from Lofi Oddity, which, there's a lot of tape plugins out there. And this one, I think, there was like a free promo thing for it that I got a while back. But I really love the tape algorithm on it. And you can go from very subtle to very intense. And it's really low CPU as far as I can tell. So I use it on a lot of different things if I'm not doing, some other tape thing. So that's another layer that is in the final mix is drowned reverb, because that just happens sometimes. When I'm making these tracks, I'm usually just experimenting. So I think the beginning of this track actually started with, I wanted to play with Ridgewalk, so I just picked some kind of sound source and started playing with Ridgewalk and found, this kind of looping textural thing. And I was like, oh, that's a great bed to build on top of. And then start playing with other things, start adding different things, and then, the original thing changes. So in this case, just ended up getting drowned in reverb, which is fine, because the real star of this track for me is these guitars. Which is how many layers here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's 5 different layers, and then this is just Mercury 7 reverb. So I recorded all of these layers in to Logic dry, and then I reamped the whole batch of them, as a send, reamped them through Mercury 7 to come up with reverb that I could, adjust after the fact. Because if I had run each one of these through reverb by itself, that would have just gotten insanely muddy and all kinds of phase issues, and it would have just sounded shitty. So yeah, they're dry, and then reamped through Mercury 7, because I think I had recently gotten the Mercury 7, so I was just excited to use it on everything, and it really, sounds great. And this is it without. And so I think the way I recorded these in was I just had a loop going, and I was just kind of noodling. And, it was probably, looking at these, it was probably 16 bars of a loop. And I just recorded, I think probably in this case 5 different takes, because that's what we're looking at. And instead of, comping them or just picking one of them, I just decided to have a bunch of them playing and panned around and repeating. These are all looping because these are all just repeating things, but they're repeating at different times. So you get this kind of, I forget what that's called, but where you have things repeating at slightly different intervals. And so the melodies overlap in different ways and create new melodies and harmonics. But very little processing was done to any of the guitars. I have a little pedal board, with an amp sam and a little bit of drive and compressor and stuff to make it so that when I record in, I try to make it so I don't have to do a lot of processing after the fact. Now that's with each track. With the bus, there's actually not that much happening either. We have compression. Let's kick this back on. So it's hitting the compressor, but it's not crazy. But with this many layers and having so many different overlapping notes, I think compression was the way to go, because you just get these loud things sticking out if you didn't. But yeah, not crazy, pretty high ratio, but it's only hitting it on the highest notes, on the highest volume notes. So we have compression, again, Lofi Oddity for a little bit of tape, not a lot of tape going on here. Yeah, just a little bit of kind of saturation. It thickens up the kind of low mids a little bit there and gives it a little bit of frequency modulation. And then a little bit of EQ, which evolves over time. If we look at the automation, very little. I just kind of open up the high end a little bit. And that even sounds nice without taking the high end off. Yeah, I actually like the way that sounds. If I did this again now, I might not put this this low pass filter on it, but so yeah, in some ways, this took a long time for me to decide, where to make some of these cuts and where to make the loop point, just so that it sounded kind of natural, but at the same time, ever evolving. There's never a point where these are hitting on the same note at the same time throughout the whole song. Yeah, so there's a decent amount of dynamics happening in this track in some ways, but a lot of it's really repetitive stuff. So this Ghost Bells pad, the pad, the bass, wind chimes, everything except these two synth layers is a repetitive loop. So a lot of the dynamics is just coming from automation, bringing layers in and out, a lot of filtering to bring layers in. So like looking at the Ghost pad, that's in the background here, but we have the high end cut off. And then later it opens up, which is not really any louder. You're just having more high end, which just kind of brings the whole thing to life a little bit. But a lot of the dynamic is coming from these two synth pads, which are kind of, I think when I made them, it was kind of just like background ear candy, but the way that they fit in with the whole mix ends up making everything feeling like it's really evolving and really moving when you actually just have a lot of repetition. Is there anything interesting going on here? You can see I use Supermassive quite a bit. I'm not shy about that. I don't know how many people use OTT in ambient music. But I use it actually quite a lot. You can hear how it brightens this up. And we're at 30%, 100% would be insane. But, in context, like that's too much, but it's not blow you out of the water too much. So I use pretty low percentages of this, but if you need to, let's kind of see if I used some guitars. I didn't. But it can really kind of bring out some of the high end on some stuff when you're looking for those textural moments. There we go. I was going to say, the fact that there's so much texture in the high end of this one, part of that is due to that the original thing, the source that I bounced from had OTT at 50%, which is really high actually for me for this type of music. But it tames some of this stuff, which on this pad, on this sort of bell layer, would otherwise be really kind of in your face, and then it brings out that high-end noisy textural stuff. There's remarkably little processing on this, and I think that's because I was really determined to use outboard gear and guitar and synth, and using this stuff where I had to commit to the effects, or I chose to commit to having the effects baked into the audio file, which for me takes a lot of time to come up with something I'm ready to commit to. But once it is, it's nice to just have a mix session that's straightforward. Most of these layers, a little bit of EQ, a little bit of reverb, a little bit of tapey stuff, but otherwise it's pretty simple. And the mastering for this track, since this was for an album, I have a separate file that's where I'm mastering all 10 tracks together to maintain sense of frequency balance and volume and stuff. But I try to make it so the mixed output is pretty much what I want it to be. I try to keep it pretty straightforward just for simplicity, and it just feels nice to be able to do that. I wasn't always able to do that. I used to have a bunch of shit on my mastering chain to try to fix kind of poor choices earlier on in the mix, but I have learned from that, so I'm grateful for that. So yeah, that is Embodiment. Let me know if you have questions, and we'll see you on the next one.